Welcome to the far future of the Orion Arm, where we've got cyborg cultists, purposeful biological freaks, very questionable cloning practices and programs, and another fourth thing that we're not supposed to do because an Eldritch Math god said no. Hi, hello, and welcome back to our favorite mech tabletop RPG, LANCER, where when your character dies, it's not always guaranteed to be just death. But man, that cloning isn't gonna go well either. Because yes, today is talking about cloning, life extension, cybernetics, biomodifications, and that other fourth thing. Though really just a brief touch on that other fourth thing. That's more of a topic amongst homunculi and AI. But starting with the beginning process of how long does someone actually just generally last or live for? What general problems can someone expect? Because when it comes to a fictional setting, age of a character can mean a lot. Not just in the sense of, hey, they've known and learned a lot of stuff, or they lived around some of these previous periods, but the perspective on life, and also said, how far can they go back? There's a big difference if a character only lived like, I don't know, 40 years to someone who lives thousands or hundreds. Difference between a human and elf, for example, in most fantasy. But lucky for us in the far future, all of humanity kinda had a bit of an uptick in lifespan. Not exactly stated why, I would assume various bits of genetic modification and just general tech, medicine, technological advancement. But alongside that increased lifespan is not just subjective, because there is also real time. So real and subjective time are pretty simple to understand, but it becomes in when there's not really faster than light travel readily available. So real time is following the Union calendar or just the galactic calendar outside of you being on ships or time dilation. Subjective is how physically old you are and how much time you experienced. So legally there are people within Union that have it that they are 700 years old, but really they've only spent a certain amount of time just on ships. But outside of that, subjective years themselves can actually be extended quite far. So first up, on your unsupported diasporan world, it could be a various flung off colony in the middle of nowhere, or just somewhere nearby that's not really properly built up to core world status yet. The average lifespan ranges from around 120 to 150 years, which for the low end of this list, that's really good. That'd be awesome. Just your average lifespan, the lowest angle of that being 120 years, at least on average. As a new baseline for humanity, that's pretty nice. But that also means you can have some really old characters. 120 years is a long time. Especially when you throw in the fact that that's subjective time. So someone can be 150 subjective, but real time could be extremely old, probably before the war. Not as in the average, but you could have people from that time. But speaking of those ships and travel, we have the cosmopolitans. So these are the people that are on stations that are kind of a bit more of the in-between, the infrastructure of the galaxy. Being in self-isolated chambers, you don't really have to deal with too much disease, rampancy, and a much more isolated environment, always near tech of some kind or life support. 170 to 200 years. 2 full centuries. And then you throw in the fact that they're on ships or stations. The real-time and subjective, that's just gonna stretch it out so far. And for your average metropolitan, those that are on core worlds or larger, more built-up planet cities where resources and materials and access are abundant. Access is in various bits of medical and, designer baby sort of situation. Not always, but possible. 180 to 230 years. The people within the seats of CENTCOM could be so old. I know. It doesn't necessarily guarantee anything specifically character or NPC-wise, but it leaves a window open for plenty of opportunities as what have they gone through, what have they experienced, what things happening in the galaxy have they lived through. All of that, however, is kind of assuming you have some kind of readily available access to just general medical facilities, or, not suffering from disease, being shot. Nothing's really directly interrupting. However, with modification, not cloning, but cybernetics, biomodification, you can extend the life of a human up to around 300. Some of them, pretty much rare cases, have extended even centuries beyond this, but on average with modifications, 300. 3 whole centuries is still crazy, but also the fact that the book acknowledges you can have people past this as well. Not to mention that they'd have to be heavily modified at this point, like living life support systems built into them, or other bits of biomodifications, though we'll actually touch on those really soon. Not just soon, right now. Speaking of those modifications, we're gonna start with cybernetics. So in general, cybernetics are seen as a bit of a common thing, but not too heavily. So when it comes to metropolitan or cosmopolitan, various bits of cybernetic implants are seen as just a general thing. Nothing of that scale yet, but just general things like, oh yeah, you have a robotic arm that's just replaced the one that was broken, damaged, some kind of genetic modification here or there, or injury. All of it looking human too. It might be entirely mechanical underneath, but it could just be looking human on the outside. The tech is there to actually make things look that realistic or well integrated. Most of them even have some kind of modification to some extent of like, yeah, why not have things that can protect your eyes or just replace some broken bones or limbs here and there? A monitor essentially in your iris. And essentially any other minor modification that you can think of, it's mostly for just general use. Rarely the extreme of, I'm gonna add a flamethrower to me, and more just, yeah, I just have some minor modification of why not just have some bits of pay stubs, some kind of storage device, something that helps with vision? But instead of being a separate thing that you'll have to pick up and wear or put on you, it's just integrated into you because the tech is so readily available. Diaspora, you're not so lucky. It is still relatively available, at least the tech and foundations for it, but the access to that high-end stuff that still looks human, that still looks relatively hidden, yeah, you might be a bit finickier on access in general and to those specifically. Expect clunkier robotic-looking arms or cybernetic implants. But in speaking of that bulky stuff, usually it's tied to some kind of fashion statement, or at least those that have access to it readily available, or general heavy modifications. So first, there's the human side of it, of like, hey, yeah, everything does, and most people use it, just look like a human still, regular human arm. If you look closely at it, then you can tell it's robotic to an extent or artificial, but most people just go for that, of hey, I'm just trying to look normal. But you might want to make a statement, whether it's fashion, political, or just because you think it looks rad. And also the diaspora and lack of access part. That bit more mechanical, that a bit more clunky, that specifically looking inhuman or not caring about the human form and its restrictions. Though in that cyborg, not really going in that human angle, purity in the machine to an extent, we fall into the camp of androidism. A large grouping that holds many different groups underneath it. The 4 big archetypes briefly mentioned in the book itself are transhumanists, which makes sense, you know, extending the human form, why limit yourself to this? Disabled rights groups that believe that everyone should be on an even playing field, everyone should actually have some kind of modified body out the gate. Kind of leading to the designer baby issue as well, like if you have the chance to make everyone better, why not make that the baseline? Next one's android cults, who believe that the human form is something entirely weak, the flesh itself is just left to decay, it is up for the individual to follow this path of the machine. Unironically, very, very much a tech priest, at least in the physicality and not caring about remaining human, essentially. There's also the nihilist machine adherents, which also falls into the tech priest camp, sort of. Groups either cultural or political, religious even, to some extent, that believe that machine minds are not the best path forward. That is up for the human mind to remain something pure, that it is that should be actually in charge of everything, the infrastructure, the ships, the weapons, purposely integrating themselves into everything else that's going on. An example, LANCER-wise, of a machine adherent would be someone that purposely takes away their limbs and physically entombs themselves within their chassis. Why bother with this mortal human form when I'm a mech? They're freaks and I love them. Though, tailing off with the cybernetics a bit, we head into the biomods. Most of these are additive, but genetic engineering is something that can be done. It is a bit finicky, having it be that the mods themselves are the most reliable / not. Essentially, it's easier to add on instead of fundamentally changing something from the beginning, at least with current tech. But back to the metropolitan, cosmopolitan, diasporan. First up, we have it being a regular common thing, to the point of either being at just general street corner clinics, or even in kiosks. Various bits of genetic enhancements that you can simply take to minor differences, you know, change skin color a bit, or the tint of it, or just this glow to your face, get rid of acne immediately, any kind of back pain, no problem. Hair color wanting to change, specifically adding a pattern to it, adding different bits of fur, because it's a bit cold, it's the winter season and you're on an ice world. They can range from mild to wild, to the point that there are also more extreme modifications that add on secondary effects, as in things that are not just modifying something. So previous biomods would just be things that, again, are affecting the hair color, the hair that's already growing on you, again, the skin color, your tongue, bones, anything that's already present. There are biomods that can add stuff. You want more ears for some reason, additional eye stalks coming out of your back, additional arms. All of those are a bit more difficult to use, but they can still be done. And also not common. At least not commonly seen or used, similar to the heavy cybernetics. In fact, with both of these modifications to an extent, it is mostly just light modifications that are seen. So cybernetics that still look human, or just for some minor replacement here or there, things that can help a little bit. Help in daily life, replace some broken bones if needed, enhance some if needed as well, but when it comes to heavy things, that's when the body itself has trouble dealing with it. Even a little bit with the minor, but this is where SSC comes in, because briefly within the SSC video as well, I mentioned that all of their mods are the ones that have the highest quality standard for not being rejected, because that is still an issue of your body dealing with a new biomod you bought from somewhere, or bits of cybernetics not properly integrating with the rest of you. But casual modification is seen as something that's relatively normal. Heavy modification, however, that's a bit more rare. Well, not rare in the sense, again, it's hard to get by, it's just more of, it's tied to a subculture, again, those political groups or those android cultists for an example, those fashion statements, that in-group, or people trying to fit a specific role, or being encouraged to get those modifications for their job. One of the most common one of these, of people just getting them in general, are the cosmopolitans, namely expecting hard vacuum, ships breaking down, and also extending that lifespan a bit. They usually physically augment themselves internally, so you don't have to put an additional suit on. You still can't last forever out there, but you'll at least be able to last longer than being caught without a suit during a breach. But surgeons needing some kind of a steadier hand or a more accurate eye able to tell details out to a distance, various bits of miners needing to keep going or lift heavy loads, having their arms or legs replaced. Any other specific industrial modification to help yourself in the workplace. Another group which is also known for being heavily modified specifically are colonists. Biomods to help with any disease that might be coming, any other physical injuries to an extent, anything readily apparent and repairable. Also for all the cloning that goes on during colonial missions, it's kind of needed, or at least these additional aids for other issues that might come up. Or the environment or climate, or some planets that just do not have it that habitable. Like, sure, it's technically breathable, but you need a filter installed, or your lungs genetically altered. But that kind of ends it on the modifications, where they kind of range from mild but readily available to heavy. Heavy modifications. But for our next thing, talking about life expansion, genetic modifications to an extent, and manipulating the human form, cloning. So cloning itself, just entering to begin with during Third Com, is in a very, very, very gray area. Not just gray in a general sense, but gray as in the LANCER sense of legality. There are some hard rules to an extent, but even then those hard rules are already left with exceptions. But in general, under Third Com, the donor needs to be a willing participant in the procedure, especially if it's a facsimile clone, but also for any parts. Because yeah, you can do partial cloning of just an organ or limb. In fact, that's actually used heavily within modern medicine, at least on those places you can get it. But heading back to the facsimile clone, it is said that within legal law under Third Com, that a clone is an individual. It is not you. It is seen as a separate individual, legally mostly. And Keely, not your property. There's a weird workaround where technically you can have it that the clone is your kid, like you've technically been the progenitor in a more classical or local sense. Again, adding to that gray area a bit, but there's plenty of individuals that have kids or hundreds of them that are technically clones. Rarely up to those numbers, but there's some exceptions we'll talk about. Now you might have noticed I said Third Com because under SecCom, clones were seen as property. This wasn't just because of I technically invested within this machine and gave you donations of my genetic code, that's partly it, but also because of the anthro-chauvinist point of view. Anthro-chauvinists, we are humanity first, specifically our definition of humanity, which doesn't include clones. Why would a clone be a true human being? They're not part of that great chain that continued from the stars. Those different colonial ships and generation ships, no, they're just fabricated. They're not a human, leading to lots and lots of slavery. Ugh, and genetically modified soldiers mass-produced for the front lines. And mines! And speaking of mass-produced, we head on to flash cloning. So you see beforehand we talked about a facsimile clone, which is someone that is made almost identical to an extent, but still takes time to grow. As in the regular amount of time to grow. Whether it's from a vat or just someone being implanted with a different clone to an extent, there's various ways of having them made. That still takes the same amount of years in time. The Harrison clones are this. When it comes to flash cloning though, that is under 5 years. The issue is that's not because the tech was there. A facsimile clone isn't going slow on purpose. Speeding up the process runs into issues. When it comes to manipulating the human body, it's easy to add things. It is very difficult to actually modify things internally, with direct intervention at least. In the process of just simply speeding up the development of an entire human body over 5 years, you run into various issues, both mental and genetic. Part of the reason this wasn't a problem though, even for productivity, was that most of the jobs these guys were made for wasn't even meant to be, well, livable. Part of the reason a clone was sent in the first place. But you might be asking why clones are being used instead of robots or automation. Within LANCER itself, the generic AI to an extent hasn't reached that full capability. You still need to look after it, it can still run into problems, it can still be hacked. It still needs power. With a human, you just need it to be able to, stay alive, feed and water itself, and that's the key thing. Itself. It takes care of itself. With under SecCom, all that needed to be done was help them and prevent them from basic diseases that can be avoided, provide them some basic shelter to an extent, feed and water them. That's it. Flash clones weren't designed to be accurate, they were designed to be fast. Fast to the point and inaccurate to the point of being able to just come out, have a rough imprinting on top of them, rough mental details, and being entirely, I'm trying to get across that this is not done well. Flash cloning is a terrible process that even when SecCom's laws were finally taken away and Third Com came in, many flash clones still suffered. Because they weren't meant to live. The genetic mods didn't work with them. They were physically broken down to the genetic code. Not to mention the mental false imprinting. Subjectivity imprinting we're about to talk about in a moment, but essentially pre-programmed lives, pre-programmed training, pre-programmed actions, feelings, emotions, understandings. All these things just quickly thrown in. Mass-produced doesn't matter. Again, it's not worrying if there's a bit of a fault. They're either a miner that's gonna die from just some kind of chemical explosion, or soldier heading onto a front line that's gonna be annihilated. It doesn't matter if there's a bit of quirks within the headspace, or no actual personality or regular life or upbringing there. It's safe to say under 3rd Com, flash cloning is illegal, while facsimile cloning still falls into that bit of gray area. The exceptions are still there though. Garrican Trade Baronies and Harrison Armory still have flash cloning programs, or at least specific baronic houses. HA just runs them. Runs their own, that is. And that's specifically where we get into some of the situations of, technically it's part of this baronic family, or within HA, it's technically all of these clones are just kids of this one manager. The situation of one parent, hundreds of kids that are all clones, and other various programs themselves to kind of work around the specific definition of flash cloning. But speaking of that mental imprint, that subjectivity, and outside of flash cloning with that, the facsimile clones and subjectivity override. So while clones themselves, under 3rd Com, or at least facsimile clones, are seen as individual people, there are plenty of groups that'll try to do otherwise. Because the tech is there to imprint some kind of mental mapping onto it, so you get a rough, broken copy of a deceased Lancer pilot, for example, you take that, you have it digitally stored to an extent, and you forcefully imprint it on a facsimile clone of them. Those are technically two different people. It's not genetically in the vat, already having all the previous memories, a permanent connection there. There is a broken time in between, and a mind you're overriding. How much of that mind has been used is where a lot of the gray area comes in. You can take in those own ethics of your own decisions on that, or at least in character of, okay, if they're in the vat this whole time and not actually technically conscious, we're kind of sure, putting that subjectivity in there, it's practically empty, right? What's scary though with this tech is that, one, it's a bit more experimental, hasn't been entirely finished because it leans into D-Corp. Also partly why it's illegal. Because it is a way of extending human life, kind of. It is just a copy. But it is that copy that is digitally stored and that is occasionally used to make things like homunculi, which is where it kind of leans further and further into that bit of treacherous waters under Ra and that first contact accord. And this isn't just a thing left for NPCs to an extent, which the Karrakin ones... private use. SSC private use. Gotta put like, we don't sell people somewhere here. But the reason this is brought up specifically in the book and around the section under death for a character, you can access it, it is illegal. Either you're underneath HA or Karrakin space, where then there's some exceptions that are legally there. But if it's anyone else outside of that, or away from those spaces or individuals or factions, yeah, you're just some kind of illegal cloning program, or at least the product of one, which is something I tried to bring up in the SSC when discussing cloning. It is not a legal thing. When you clone, you gain quirks, which are, they could be physical, they could be mental, they always happen with flash cloning, and they happen on the second time you do subjectivity override. So essentially, you're going to run into a time where you can't clone a copy of a copy. This isn't the infinite loophole to immortality. There is an end point, even if you are not counting that first end point. Maybe you can figure out a subjective override onto a different body. One where that's not necessarily an issue mentally or physically, because that is part of the reason you still need to clone for it. Because when it comes to D-Corp and subjectivity override, it's not alive, it doesn't work, it's a homunculus until that point, if it is made into a homunculus. Because the brain itself and how it interacts with tech and the imprinting on both just isn't really studied that well. Again, experimental tech, and also outlawed under the first contact. So while they can't just store you in a computer, they can imprint it onto an empty mind that maps yours, at least relatively physically, genetically, muscle memory to an extent, and it seems to work. It just kind of fills in the blanks there. The issue comes up with subjectivity on another person where theoretically that doesn't work because it would just kill both. But who knows? You're already in the illegal realm of flash cloning. But in speaking of that illegal realm of flash cloning, how that might interact with your Lancer or your character, or that post-death character, or your second Lancer, I don't know, hard to tell. with who's the original. The modifications as well, again, have those crazy cyborgs, have those genetic abominations. I jest, but you could have those. Because while most of the things that we've talked about have been beneficial, none of these have to be. I mean, the flash cloning to the extent is already pretty horrific, but when it comes to the modifications, cybernetics that are purposely harmful to an extent, the attaching a flamethrower to someone, locking yourself into a mech or chassis, or into a spaceship. The genetic modifications not just being things that are like nice and decorative, but trying to make yourself into a lethal weapon. Not just in sense of just, oh, I can hold more weapons, or I have armored like scales. I'm also poisonous to anyone that touches me, or looks at me, or breathes in my general vicinity. Venomous, fangs, various bits of things just to be a lethal artificial predator. Because with all of these, you can make monsters. Because while there's the general mundane and use and accepted norms, all three of these have their extremes. Same with the length of life. All of that eventually rounding out into you can have the strangest characters. These are not humans as we currently know them. We assume that. We assume that from our perspective, they're just a normal person. People on Metropolitan and Core Worlds, heavily modified. Not necessarily to the point of heavy modifications, but they have general little ones everywhere. They don't have to deal with the problems that we do. They have different bits of panacea that are artificial. They're immune to everything practically. Never getting sick, abilities to stay up and awake, not tired all the time. Being able to easily heal and replace bones. You have these genetic modifications at kiosks on Core Worlds, or at least Metropolitan. And then the extremes. You can have such extremes. So go wild with it. Do not forget these. This is the far future of the Orion Arm. And these are no longer just humans. Thank you for watching the video, and oh boy, it's a minor topic, but one that has a lot of ripple into what goes on. Because we talked about it with SSC to a point, but especially when it comes to what they can make. Sure, they're the bougie end of it, and it reflects a little bit on cybernetics and different bits of genetic modification, but you can go wild. You can have it mass-produced and used. It's not a specific niche thing. It is in certain categories, but the access to it isn't. The ability to do these things isn't. Like, I know in my games I have some characters that are heavily modified. Not just under SSC to an extent, but just, yeah, it's a guy who runs a gunsmith and weapon shop, kind of that machine nihilist, doesn't trust NHPs to an extent, built into his fabricator. All those designs are his, not some mechanical blueprints generated. That guy's a freak. Said in a loving way to an extent, because I love tech priests, I love those crazy monstrous characters, or just those that are heavily modified to an extent and going all in on the possibilities this stuff involves. But I hope this brought up some ideas for possible characters, or how your Lancers can play into it, how they can use it, or how cloning might come up in your games. In any case though, thank you for watching, thank you to my patrons, and have a nice day.